If you'll turn in your Bibles to James, we're now in chapter 5, and we're just going through verses 1 through 6 right now. James 1 through 6. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. My guess is, as I've read that, you may have checked out entirely. It's just 6 verses, but my guess is that you might have checked out entirely, and probably didn't even take the middle of the passage for you to do so. For some of us, for me, the first time I read it, it was the first 3 words. Come now, you rich, or the first 4 words, I guess. As soon as I see that, I'm like, oh, this doesn't apply to me, But I don't want you to think that way, hopefully. Of course, I'm no Joel Osteen, but even the poor in our day have more wealth than all the kings and queens of old. The majority of people in here have a cell phone. There's more technology in that little flat box alone than entire civilizations had. The president of the U.S. never had one until likely either Clinton or Bush. How about the beds we sleep in? Even those of us who have had the same mattress for 10 or 15 years have better worn mattresses than royalty had for ages. The food we have and its affordability, look around you. There's probably more flavor in a Dorito than the majority of people through human history have experienced in their life. There are such great blessings of wealth all around us that we don't notice at all. That said, it's no wonder why we also don't notice then our gluttony, our wastefulness, our ill-gotten gain, our proclivity to withhold rather than to share. It's easy to read a passage like this and think, oh, it doesn't apply to me, James is giving a warning to the wealthy of his day. And we may not be the wealthy of our day, but there's still a lot we can learn from this passage. So that the wealth we are blessed with, whether we notice it or not, hopefully it helps you notice it. The wealth that we are blessed with, we use it in a way that glorifies God rather than ourselves. To those James wrote to here, he's offering a grim warning that a neglect for God's royal law, that goes pretty far back. We've been in James for a little while, but remember that royal law he mentioned in chapter 2, right? It's love your neighbor as yourself. He says a warning here that if you neglect that royal law, the call to love your neighbor as yourself, it leads to sin-filled chaos. And here in the context of wealth specifically, we're asked to consider 3 such effects. A consternation from wealth, or a anxiety or dismay, a consternation from wealth. In verse 1, the corrosion of wealth, mentioned in verses 2 and 3, as well as our condemnation in wealth for those who don't heed the warning in verses 4 to 6. Notice James uses the same form of address both in chapter 4, verse 13 and 5:1. 4 verse 13, remember, "Come now, you who say." And so you see that again here, indicating that these two paragraphs are related. Both rebuke for worldly arrogance, remember that we talked about then, and selfishness associated with wealth. You could see how those might go hand in hand. But first, let's look at verse 1 in regards to the effect of a consternation from wealth, a feeling of anxiety or dismay that it can often bring as a result of the love of it. He says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you." Or some translations might say weep and wail, but they're either way typical descriptions of how people react to the judgment of God on the day of the Lord. Right? You've got Isaiah 15:3. "In the streets they wear sackcloth, on the roofs and in the public squares they wail, prostrate with weeping." Amos 8:3. "In that day, declares the sovereign Lord, the songs in the temple will turn to wailing." That's something I wonder about, that verse there. The songs in the temple will turn to wailing. We know, of course, that money, we've talked about it before, money can bring temporary happiness. But as I've mentioned, it comes with a lot more responsibility as well. It makes me think of, there's a basketball player, he was in the NBA for a while, but his name was Delonte West. And you see now reports of him like in and out of jail or homeless on the street begging people for money. This is a man who, notice in the NBA, you minimum, if you're on the bench, are going to make $500,000 a year. Minimum. That's just sitting on a chair, right? This guy was pretty good. He was pretty good. And I think at one point he was making like $1 million a year, something like that. And yet, like, he's currently, like often seen begging people for money on the street. We act like wealth will fix all of our problems, but sometimes it just gives us an excuse to cave into that hedonism all the more. I mean, you think of a lot of people who win the lottery or win money from gambling. Within 10 years, they're back to being broke. And the reason is because if you're that irresponsible with your money enough to be, gambling to that degree or whatnot, spending your money on things of that nature, it's like, well, you're also probably not wise enough with your finances to keep it up now, are you? And it's similar, like people fall to the problem that, as Michael Scott says in The Office, mo money, mo problems, It comes with a load of responsibility. And so it makes you think that that guy who speeds by you in his, cherry red Corvette, you don't know what's going through his mind when he does so. Maybe he's contemplating, wrapping it around the next telephone pole. You just don't know what people are going through. So there's a consequence of consternation that often comes with wealth. It brings a load of responsibility, and with that, anxiety, dismay, problems. And people who crave after it and chase it and make that the pursuit of their life, you see, weep and howl for the miseries that are going to come upon them, because they've stored up all of their hope in something that they can't take with them. And we'll come back to that. I think I've mentioned, someone once, said, asked me as a minister, it was just kind of, at work, some of the guys were talking, they were like, well, what do you think? Do you think money can buy happiness? And I said, absolutely I do. He was like, absolutely I do. Of course money can buy happiness. But it can't buy joy. It can't buy joy. I was kind of humbled. Last week or so, there was a friend I was messaging, and he's certainly pretty well off. And I was like, I really love the chair that you have at your house. Do you mind telling me what kind it is? And he sent me a link to the website to go find it, and I'm looking at the price of the chair and the ottoman together, and they're pretty much the cost of my wedding. like for the chair and the ottoman. So that was a little bit humbling for me. But would I be smiling if I sat in it? Oh yeah, but it can buy happiness. But you can't buy joy. Something that's not circumstantial, something that's found in the Lord, rather than something that is so fleeting. There's an Instagram page called Preachers and Sneakers. And it goes through, it just talks about some of these big church, big name guys, and it shows you their outfit, what they're wearing. And I was going through that because this sermon made me think of it. And I saw men with $4,000 shoes, $3,000 jackets, and they're up at the pulpit. People are crazy with their money sometimes. At work, they always have HGTV on, and there was this one couple that just clearly had such a large house they didn't even know what to do with it, and so many random things that they didn't even know what to do with it. The husband and wife were bickering. They were like, "What are we going to do with a double sink in the middle of the master bedroom?" And the husband, just trying to think of anything, was like, "Wash our hands." It's just so many things that it just blows my mind. The desire for more and more it borders on obnoxious, and it doesn't mean you can't have nice things. It just means that you need to be careful. The nicest thing I own probably is my guitar, and I think I scratched it freshman year by accident, or it might have been junior year. So I didn't have it freshman year, but I scratched it. And every time I see the guitar, I just I hate that I did that. And the reason is because I have this really nice thing, and because it's super nice, it magnifies the stress that anything might happen to it. And so picture that on a large scale. People who wrap nice things around themselves. Imagine wearing that $3,000 jacket out to eat at Christos. I don't want to get spaghetti on them. You're going to be terrified the whole time. You're not going to do a single thing. Wealth comes with a great magnified stress and consternation. And there's a point that quickly becomes blurred between us having things and things having us. Right? That's why Scripture says the love of money is the root of all evil. It's not saying money's evil, or you shouldn't, it would be silly not to desire money, but to love money to the point where that's your chase in life. That's what gets you out of bed in the morning. it's like, that's sad. That's not okay. There's a difference between comfort and excess. This isn't saying you can't live in comfort. It's not saying you can't have nice things. Simplicity, though, is a Christian discipline. I think it's sometimes called minimalism now. But a lot of people hear that and think, again, like, I can't have nice things, or I can't have a lot of things. Simplicity isn't, I can't have nice things, or I can't have a lot of things. It's the things I have, I need to use. And too much excess. Then one, I've got it, and other people who might need it can't have it. But also, you're kind of, as a beacon of light in the world, when people see you living with great excess while they're in turmoil, how do you think that looks for an outsider looking in? It doesn't come across as loving at all. So what you have, you are to use, and any comfort you have, you shouldn't be very look at me about it. So it brings consternation. But also, another thing to take into account is the corrosion of wealth. And this is sort of the why question to the other point. It's just like, why not live in gluttony or excess? Why not let my love of things consume me? If it makes me happy, that's my prerogative. It's like, that's my life. And here's the answer. Happy doesn't mean best for you. Remember the joy conversation? Satan's counterfeit in today's day for be holy as I am holy is this be happy message. Be holy. I don't care if you're happy or not, The corrosion of wealth. In verses 2 and 3, your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You've laid up treasure in the last days. It's like you've laid up treasure. It's like you can't take it with you, Happy doesn't mean best for you. There's a quote from Jim Elliot. I usually quote Elizabeth. Here, I'll quote Jim for today. But Jim Elliot said, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." Now, if you're taking notes, that's one to take note of. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. This is coming from a missionary who was martyred at 28 years old. We talked last week some about mortality, if you remember. We talked about how eternity isn't so in front of us, or in the future as we like to think, but is instead sort of beside us all the while. And at any point we can move over into that. I've been reading Shadow of the Almighty still, and there's a portion where Jim writes to Elizabeth Elliot, or he calls her Betty. There's a point where Jim writes to her in chapter 20. And he says this. Keep in mind, again, someone who's martyred at 28 years old. He says, "I do fear sometimes that something will happen to you and I will lose you. And then what would I do? Where would I be when I wasn't where I seemed to be? Where would my imagination go when I went to sleep? There could be nothing else in life like this for me. Funny, but I never think of my having the accident and your losing me." Yeah, that's exactly what happened. It's for those who know the story, it's humbling reading that, and thinking like, man, he almost like prophesied it in a way. You can't bring a U-Haul to heaven, as they say. There's a corrosion of wealth. These people, they didn't follow Jesus' exhortation in Luke 12:33, right? Where he says, sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. Invest in the things money can't buy. On things that allow you to best love those you love and those who love you, and all else that glorifies God. You don't have to be one of the rich guys to understand that. This applies to you, it applies to me. And actually, what's so funny about Kaylee is she was visiting last week, and there's been days where, because it's been so slow at work, where they're like, you can go home early if you want. And I'm like, man, I really should not take that financial hit twice in a week, because it'd be unpaid for me. I don't have PTO. So I called her. I was like, well, what should I do? We'd be able to, visit more, but also I really don't think I should do that, but she said, well, I think time together is priceless. I was like, okay. I was like, looks like I'm going home, boys. What do you do with that? So, but she's on to something. She's on to something. Let's look finally at, for those who don't heed this warning, our condemnation in wealth. This is the result of what happens if you don't listen to what I just said. So the latter portion was the why question, but here we have the or else part of the warning, so to speak. James continues in 4-6, behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. This is verse 4. I'll pause there. All right, look at where it says, wages you failed to pay to the workers. Promptly paying workers in this society that James is writing to in this context, promptly paying workers was especially important, right? Because people lived pretty much hand to mouth there in a way that, you have to have your immediate needs met or satisfied, because the lack of money can mean life or death, or at least pretty rough struggling, so to not pay your workers promptly, it often it could have meant in Old Testament words often was associated with murdering people, essentially, because really, you don't pay them their wages, they can't do anything. So think of the ill-gotten gain, and also mistreatment of their wealth. The way they got it was by holding back the wages of the unemployed, or of those they employed, and those who lived. They lived in luxury for themselves, storing it up so it couldn't. A lot of people think this is an injunction on not saving your money, but what they were doing was they stored up their money so it wasn't circulating or trickling down to anyone else. So no one else benefits from that wealth. And of course, that's what makes capitalism work, is the fact that, those you're working for, get paid, too. Let's look at verse 6. He says, I'm skipping verse 5. Let's look at verse 6. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. Right? So that's what I was talking about earlier, where it says you don't pay them their wage promptly. You pretty much have murdered them. Because they in a society that's so hand to mouth like that, it's like, you don't pay me, I can't live. I can't buy food, I can't, or I guess now they say sort of paycheck to paycheck, kind of. You've condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. And by righteous person, a lot of people think, well, maybe this is an allusion to Jesus, because some translations say the innocent one or the righteous one. Maybe that's, an allusion to him. But I think it's probably just a paradigmatic religious person. And the scholar D.A. Carson agrees with me with that. He points out the Old Testament and Jewish writings regularly condemn rich people for exploiting and therefore indirectly killing the poor. He mentions in the Apocrypha, in the apocryphal writings, in Sirach chapter 34, says to take away a neighbor's living is to commit murder. To deprive an employee of wages is to shed blood. And there's plenty more Old Testament examples, but that's just to show it's not just scriptural, but common in Jewish writings of that day, that those that you would employ if you withheld wages. That was sort of pretty much the equivalent of what you were doing. And finally, I want to step back to verse 5. It says, you have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. Remember our conversation on self-indulgence? You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. Now, I noticed two things about this verse. First, I don't know why slaughter is not pronounced slaughter. Second, aside from that, it kind of makes you think of that phrase self-indulgence makes you think of what I was saying about Love's truck stop during last week's message or so. Steve and Laura texted me, by the way. They were like, we're on the way to this place. They were like, we're stopping at a Love's. Do you want a helmet or a sword? I was like, okay. I texted back. I was like, actually, I'm wearing the armor of God. Thank you. But yeah, so you have self-indulgence there, which so this is an add-on to that message. And I kind of mentioned that briefly at the beginning of this. It's an add-on. So it says, now it adds, you have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. So it vividly condemns the rich now for selfishly using their resources on themselves and failing to share them with others. In Ezekiel 16:49, we read, now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. Like cattle unaware that they are about to be slaughtered, is what Carson adds. He says these people are like cattle unaware that they're about to be slaughtered. Just living luxurious lifestyles, completely unaware and unconcerned with their fellow man. It's common for me to come across people in verbal competitions of who has the nicest this or that. And you probably hear them all the time as well. You hear them in songs, you hear them in TV, you hear them in commercials. It's one of the most embarrassing points in my life, probably ever, was I was at a youth camp, and which is usually how those stories start out. But I was at youth camp, and there was this fella my age. His name was Josh. I haven't talked to him in ages. That's why I feel comfortable using his name. But most embarrassing thing in my life, he had a speech impediment. And I said, this is when I first met him, I said, "That's a cool accent. Where are you from?" Yeah. So that was my reaction as well. So like when he told me, actually I have a speech impediment, so I was like, okay, great. So I tried to play it off, and that always works well for me. I tried to play it off by saying, well, you could pretend, and no one would think, then it'd be super cool. And most embarrassing time in my life, but the reason this made me think of that was because it's like, these folks have an impairment, but they're going around talking and living as if it's the cool, they have a cool accent, right? Or, and I hope that's not an offensive illustration, but it just made me think of it because it's like, there's something wrong. And you're living as if like you're competing, I have this, I have that. It's like you have an obsession. You have a God that isn't the God of the Bible. It's your hedonism. It's your desire. So there's a consternation that is the consequence of wealth. There's the corrosion of wealth. But also there's our condemnation in wealth. You keep playing pretend like that. Unaware of your blessings, unaware of the things that God has given you, or living in excess with a love of things. It's like you've got another thing coming. And that's sort of the or else of this message, right? It is a warning on wealth. We have a whole generation of believers thinking God's will is for them to be wealthy. And to that I say, and finish with this, let the words of the old Irish hymn steer them right. Riches I heed not, nor man's empty praise. Thou my inheritance, now and always. Thou and thou only, the first in my heart. O King of glory, my treasure, thou art. Let's pray.